Hello and thanks for joining us for the Midday News. Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries Agency members are preparing to implement the draft conservation and management measures for improving labour standards and human rights expected to be adopted at the 21st Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission meeting in Fiji later this year. At a recent interagency workshop in Fiji, members discussed ways to implement and enforce the draft labour standards on fishing vessels. The plan to have a binding conservation and management measures for improving labour and crew welfare and human rights was passed at the 20th meeting of the WCPFC in Rarotonga, Cook Islands last year. The eviction exercise at Busara settlement is underway. The eviction started this morning at 10 a.m. on land posting 2156, 2157 and 2159 on the 9-mile area in Port Moresby. According to No. 1 Super Limited, approximately over 9,000 building structures have been constructed in the area. The squatters have been voluntarily to move out of the area for the past 3 weeks to today. The eviction, which started today, will continue for the next 3 weeks. Police in NCD have apprehended 5 men and 1 woman for burning the Papua New Guinea flag during the what police deemed an illegal protest by Busara squatters in Port Moresby yesterday. The acting commander of the National Capital District and Central Province Assistant Commissioner of Police, Peter Guinness, has confirmed this. Guinness said these suspects will face the full consequences of their actions because the protest conducted was illegal. He said the suspects are being detained at the holding cell at Baroko Police Station. The eviction exercise at Busara is underway. The Catholic Church in Yule Island, Central Province, celebrated 139 years of arrival of the first missionaries on the island last week. The Eucharistic celebrations were presided by the head of Berena Diocese, Bishop Otto Separi, and was attended by the Governor of Central, Rufina Peter, Gulf Governor Sir Chris Hiveta, and member for Kairikuhiri, Peter Iso Aimo. The first missionaries of the Sacred Heart, or MSC, arrived in Yule Island on 4th July 1885, led by late Bishop Henry Varius. The MSC priests, upon arrival, introduced health and education services to the island, and Central Governor Rufina Peter is a product of the OLSH Girl High School on the island, one of the schools established by MSC missionaries. In regional news, Australia's politicians, state and federal, claim the governments are doing all they can to combat domestic violence, but frontline workers in the sector are pleading for more, saying chronic underfunding and staff shortages continue to put lives at risk.
As a Western Sydney community continues to mourn 3 children allegedly killed by their father, both the state and federal governments have fielded questions about the rising domestic violence death toll across the country.
There's a recognition from the government that we can be doing more. One of the big dilemmas that we have is there doesn't seem to be a lot of commonality between the alleged perpetrators.
I have to be really clear that this is not a new issue when it comes to family and domestic violence. We need to look in all the areas of prevention, early intervention, response and healing and recovery.
Less than 48 hours after the children died, 21-year-old Nunya Kuraleba was allegedly murdered by her boyfriend in a Sydney unit. So far this year, 41 women have allegedly been killed by men in Australia. In Melbourne, police have charged a man over the death of English teacher Annette Brennan, whose body was found at a waste management facility last week. And in Adelaide, a man allegedly deliberately set fire to a home on Sunday while his former partner and her 3 children were inside. No one was injured.
Child protection crisis. End the crisis now.
In Sydney's West today, domestic violence and child protection workers held a rally calling for more funding.
The simple fact is that there's not enough people to get to all the children that need to be seen.
It's not working properly now. We need changes, we need money, we need staffing. We need to look at why we're losing staff.
Child protection crisis.
More desperate calls from an under-resourced sector fighting to prevent further tragedies.
A state-of-the-art composting facility has opened in northwest Tasmania, ready to process food and garden organics from 6 regional councils. The facility will be capable of processing 50,000 tonnes of organic waste, reducing the amount going to landfill.
Tasmania's waste problem is piling up. Each Tasmanian generates on average a tonne or more of waste that goes to landfill each year. And while some landfill can keep being used for decades, others are nearly full.
It has this long-term cost that most people don't think about. Finding a new site is very expensive and challenging.
This new state-of-the-art composting facility at Dulverton near Devonport could be part of the answer.
Across regional and rural Australia, the tyranny of distance and small population base means traditionally it's cost-effective to throw most household waste into landfill like this. But over time, as that organic matter breaks down, it releases methane into the atmosphere and leachate into nearby waterways, causing problems that extend far beyond the life of the landfill.
The $32 million facility is the first of its kind in Tasmania. It will be able to handle 50,000 tonnes of organic waste, putting it in specially designed tunnels where it is turned into high-quality compost, all without spilling a drop.
If you look across the state, we're the only in-vessel facility, so others are making compost but out in the open. And with the Tasmanian winters and the wet springs that we can have, that's really challenging to do. The benefit for FOGO as a community is that in collecting all that material, we know we can move between 40 and 60% out of your regular landfill bin.
That compost can be used by farmers like Paul Bennett.
Yeah, we've been here at Ashgrove been buying compost off Dulverton for over 10 years now. We use compost to build up the profile of the soil.
Closing the loop on Tasmania's organic waste challenge.
Large retailers in New South Wales, including supermarkets, will be banned from opening on Anzac Day at all. In a move backed by veterans and the retail union, the state government is tightening trade restrictions to combat what the Premier has called the creeping commercialisation of the day.
Remember those who fought for freedom. Out of respect for the Anzacs, large retailers are currently banned from opening until after 1 p.m. From next year, supermarkets and department stores will have to stay shut for the entire public holiday.
We believe there's been a commercialisation, a creeping commercialisation of Anzac Day.
The government carried out a review last year and says most feedback supported all-day restrictions.
I think the shops are open long enough. They don't need to be open any further.
If people can't show one-day respect, well, what's left?
Some businesses, like cafes, chemists and news agencies, can remain open all day.
I think it's a great way to ensure we protect the sanctity of Anzac Day.
Retail workers want to stop with the rest of the community to recognise the sacrifice.
The Australian Retailers Association opposes the move, which it says would restrict consumer choice and reduce the earning potential for retail employees.
I know that there's a criticism that says, well, you can go and have a beer with your friends, but you can't go to Woolies and buy baked beans or something. Look, there is a difference between the two things.
The change to the legislation has bipartisan support and will bring New South Wales into line with most other Australian states.
Well, it just gives people more of a chance to reflect on why Anzac Day is.
A day of commemoration, not commerce.
In sports, Port Moresby Hockey Association 11th competition completed its round 1 matches last weekend and heads into Group 2 starting this weekend at the Sir John Guy Stadium, Hockey Pavilion. Group 1 comprises 7 rounds of matches and Group 2 is also going to be 7 rounds before the finals. The Port Moresby Hockey Association says the tournament has been competitive for the men's and women's divisions. At this stage, it is too early to predict who would win the tournament as all teams were performing well. 8 teams are participating in the tournament in both divisions with the finals expected in October. Thanks for your company. Join us at 6 p.m. for the main bulletin.